let's get started. So again, just much like last week's talk, we're going to start off just by acknowledging the amazing team at Prime Care Family Health. I'm so grateful for their support and their help in setting up these round of webinars. Just so you know, if you didn't come last week, there's 4 webinars that I am running. This is the second of 4. There's one next week on parenting children with ADHD, and then in 2 weeks after that, we're going to be having a talk for families who are going through transitions through divorce and separation. I also want to thank Dr. Erin Gelgut, who is a psychologist at our clinic, who happens to be kind enough to be helping with today's presentation. So I want to thank her as well for being present, and thank you. Um, Couple of friendly reminders. If you notice, we're keeping cameras and microphones off. If you have questions, there is an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. Actually, the questions maybe in the Q&A, and I might ask you for some reactions, and maybe we can keep that in the chat. And then I will try to answer questions, particularly at the end. But if there's any pressing questions, I've asked Aaron to let me know if there's any questions that it might make sense if I answer in the moment. So let's talk a little bit about what we will be discussing this evening. We're going to start off talking a little bit about something that is maybe a little bit uncomfortable discussing, which is parental burnout. We're going to talk about what it is, what it looks like, what are some signs. We're going to shift then into mindful parenting. And we're going to discuss why we want to engage in mindful parenting and how that can help to build resilience in our children. And then the last part, the big section at the end is going to be looking at emotions. We're going to be doing some preliminary sort of basic emotion 101, and then we're going to talk about one component that I mentioned in passing last week, and that is how we validate emotions in our children, which is one of the very first steps, or one of the most important steps, excuse me, to make connections, to connect with our children in a mindful way. A little bit about me. So my name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I am a clinical and school psychologist. I'm the director of child and adolescent service at Etobicoke Psychological, our EPS. Our clinic in Vaughan is called EPS Family Health, and I worked for 10 years in the school system. In the last 3 to 4 years, I have been working full-time in private practice, and I have a few passions. One of my passions is ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is the theoretical framework that I use, and I talked a little bit about it last week. I love giving presentations. And lastly, I love to supervise. And so I supervise quite a few early career psychologists. It's a passion of mine. And so I'm excited to use a couple of those skills today. So a couple of things that I want to point out, and this is going to be part of every conversation that I have, is I am not providing any direct psychological services today. What I mean by that is that we won't be able to talk about specific cases or situations. I'm hoping to provide some information and resources that will maybe help you to make tweaks in your relationship with your children, positive tweaks in your relationship with your children. The other thing, and this is going to be true for all my talks, again, my goal is to cultivate awareness. And I will use, this idea of planting little seeds and really emphasizing this idea of 1 degree change. I'll give a quick synopsis of the 1 degree change analogy. Imagine that you're on a huge cruise ship, right? And the captain decides to change the trajectory of the cruise ship by 1 degree. Given that a ship is massive, you wouldn't feel that one degree change. However, if you take the trajectory of that ship on its original course versus where it ends up based on 1 degree change, it could be a vastly different spot in the ocean. And so this idea of how can we make one small little change today that might not be noticeable, that can lead to meaningful improvements down the road. The other thing that's important to talk about is a lot of what I talk about can have their own presentations. Actually, the very last slide, I've done a whole presentation on the very last slide, of the topics on the very last slide. And so I'm not going to be able to expand so much. I'm a little bit worried about the amount of information I'm sending to you today. So I'm hoping that you're able to grasp some these concepts, these seeds that I'm hoping to plant. And I would be more than happy to have any subsequent conversations or presentations on some of the topics of interest. I want to start off in a very mindful way by checking in. And so let me ask you, you don't have to respond. I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a check-in. I want you to notice yourself wherever you are, If you're sitting on a chair, on a couch, standing in a car, I want you to just do a bit of a scan. What are you feeling? What are your thoughts? Are you thinking this guy better speed up? This guy better cover good things? Is this a waste of time? Do I have to get my kids, pick them up from practice? I have that project at work. I want you to notice anything that's swirling around inside your head. Perhaps you're not present. You're not actually really paying attention and you're thinking about the future. What if, what if, or maybe you're thinking about the past. Oh, I can't believe I did that. I want you to start just by noticing. No judgment. We're not saying you shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't think about that. We're just noticing at this stage. The premise of today's conversation is to try to talk about our ability to expand mindful parenting approaches. The question is why? Why are we talking about mindful parenting? Um, and the reason is, one of the things that's come up, especially after COVID, is the how often. Um, hold on, let me just see. Sorry, I just noticed a question about the slides, but I think I'm hoping people can see the slides. So one of the things that's come out, especially after COVID, is an increase in what we term parental burnout. And some of the signs of whether you're experiencing parental burnout can be things such as feeling overwhelming exhaustion related to the parental role. And I'm actually going to ask you, you don't have to respond again, but I want you to notice, have you ever experienced these? Because I would imagine that most of us are going to say yes. So the first one is an example of this would be waking up and be like, oh, I got to do that today. Feeling exhausted with parts of the parental role. Secondly, is you might find yourself feeling emotionally distant from your children. Things like an example of this would be you're doing the bare minimum. Okay, guys, here's dinner, and you walk away. You can't find yourself around them. You no longer are engaging in pleasurable activities as a parent. You're no longer sitting there and having conversation because part of you is actually feeling ineffective as a parent. You're noticing yourself being short with them, being angry, being irritable, and you're no longer again enjoying those interactions with your children. These are some of the most common signs of parental burnout. And if you look at actually the stats of parental burnout, post-COVID, I saw numbers anywhere, when I looked up in the literature, I saw numbers from anywhere from 8.5% of parents up to about 26% of parents who are experiencing parental burnout. And the number actually skyrockets to 66% when you ask parents whether they feel they're experiencing parental burnout. And so parents are feeling overwhelmed with the multitude of roles that we sort of have to carry besides being a parent. So, parental burnout. What are some risk factors towards parental burnout? What are some things that we need to consider? First one is perfectionism. Are you hard on yourself in terms of what is expected of you as a parent, or do you have really high expectations for your children? What happens if there's a mistake in the family? When someone screws up, when someone fails, when someone has a moment of, whether some challenge that they cannot overcome. Second sign or risk factor would be, do you have trouble understanding the emotional states or accepting your own emotional states or that of your children? So if you find yourself feeling frustrated with your child, do you push it away and like, oh, I'm not allowed to feel frustrated with my child. Like I cannot feel angry towards my child. Or perhaps your child is experiencing with a particular thing, and you're saying, why? It's not even a big deal. And you're really uncomfortable with the emotional response that your child is displaying. Another potential risk factor is engaging in inconsistent parenting, right? I think this is probably one of the most common recommendations in parenting is try to be consistent, right? Stick to your guns, so to speak. If you have an expectation, follow through with expectations. This can also happen when you have two parents or more than one parent. You can have inconsistent parenting that can increase the stress in the family. Other risk factors include feeling alone, not supported, whether that's with a co-parent or even feeling alone and disconnected from family, friends, and society as a whole. Another risk factor is experiencing something that is prolonged and that depletes your overall energy. An example of this is if you're taking care of a sick parent, or if you are facing extreme stress at work, something that just leaves you drained and depleted, it can increase the risk of parental burnout. And then lastly, this is a big one, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, is are you taking time for yourself? The less likely or the less we spend time for ourselves and engage in leisure time and self-care, the higher the risk of developing parental burnout. So seed number one, right from the start, first seed I want to plant is this idea that if we are experiencing difficulty as parents and we're feeling some sense of parental burnout, whether we're feeling overwhelmed with the role as a parent, we feel disconnected from our children, we feel ineffective, we're no longer engaging in things we enjoy as a parent, awareness is the first step. Noticing. Very simply, what we did at the beginning of today's conversation when I asked you to just notice what's happening, what are you thinking about? What's around you? What are your thoughts? Are you thinking about future or past? The other thing to consider is that it's okay to ask for help, right? Whether that's with a family member or even from a professional. And then lastly, this is something that's going to come up. Sorry, I'm getting feedback there. The last step in terms of the seed I want to plant here is this idea that I would like for you to view the concept of engaging in leisure time and self-care through the eyes of your children. So many of the parents that I engage with will tell me that they feel guilty to take time for themselves, that they don't actually put a premium on this idea that they need to take care of themselves and have their own time. I encourage you to view that through the eyes of your loved one. If your child knew how important it is for you to have downtime, to see the benefits of having time for you to take that bath, for you to sip that coffee, to go away for a weekend, if your child knew how important it is for you, I would imagine that they would want you to take that leisure time. The other thing I want to just talk about is this idea of why we're talking about mindful parenting. Part of the reason why I'm talking about mindful parenting is that I think it adds something that traditional parenting like programs or approaches miss. So in typical parenting programs, we often emphasize skill building and trying to notice like how do you provide reinforcement, how do you follow rules, that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I think is missing from traditional parenting approaches is that we don't account for parental experience. What are the thoughts and feelings and reactions and meaning that we attach to parenting scenarios? For example, things like, do we notice thoughts like, my son should know better? Or things like, he's doing this on purpose. Why does he always do this? Why does he always choose to ruin dinner? Those are the things that we don't necessarily address when we're looking at things from traditional parenting approaches. So this is why I think that mindful parenting adds a variable that is quite powerful in terms of how we interact with our children. One of the things that goes with mindful parenting is this idea of context and how important context is. So I'll give you an example. I want you to think about this. Imagine that your child is having an emotional outburst of some kind. They're feeling overwhelmed, and we have what we call they're having what we call a tantrum, and it's happening at home. I'm curious, what are your thoughts and feelings? Like maybe you can put in the chat. What are some things? Your child's having a meltdown, you're about to leave the house, or maybe it's just a regular Saturday, they're having a meltdown. Any thoughts or feelings? Anyone want to share in the chat as to like what they might be feeling when their child is having something like that? Frustrated. Yeah, 100%. For sure. Now, let's imagine that that same emotional outburst or tantrum is happening at a family function. Maybe you're at some religious, church or synagogue, or maybe it's happening at a restaurant, or maybe it's happening at a school function or a soccer game or a recital. What are your thoughts and feelings when your child is having an emotional outburst in this type of environment? Is it different? I'm curious if anyone would be willing to share. Is it different when it's happening in a place in public? I see someone typing, so I'm waiting a little bit. I think so. Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely. You know what's funny? I'm going to be share. It's like as a psychologist, God forbid my children display like an emotional outburst because right away, especially if it's happening at like maybe in the school, in my neighborhood, people are like, look at that. That's a child psychologist child who's having that reaction. And so you better believe that sort of sense is coming up for me. And if I'm not aware of it, I won't notice how that might change how I parent in that scenario. Now, in this example, I think it's easy to sort of understand that if I'm alone at home or if we're alone at home and no one's around, I might respond with annoyance or frustration. But if I'm in public, I'm going to maybe feel a sense of embarrassment or a sense of urgency to deal with it, or it might change how I interact with it. In this, I think it's easier to understand how that context can change things. But do we really pay attention to context in other scenarios? Do we really pay attention to those things that might be happening on a day-to-day basis, like that what the stress that we're carrying from work, or again those judgments that I've made about my son maybe doing something on purpose, or always choosing to do this, or as a Latino male, he's not allowed to do this, or whatever it is that I might be thinking. Do I really notice that context that changes my parenting? That's why mindful parenting is really important when we start to notice all those factors that interact how we engage in our parenting role. So what is, you hear mindfulness, it's discussed everywhere you go. And mindfulness, from the way I'm talking about it, it's about being compassionate, rich, and non-defensive awareness of the present moment, which is one of the things I try to, encourage when we did that, the opening sequence where I asked you to just notice. Right? Are you thinking about the past? Are you thinking about, work? Are you thinking about whether this guy's going to add anything of value to my life? Those are all okay. We're not going to judge. We're going to notice those thoughts. They're present, like clouds in the sky. We're going to notice. In mindful parenting, what we're talking about is an approach that emphasizes the ability to simply and compassionately notice and accept our thoughts and feelings rather than fighting them. If you're here in last week's conversation, one of the things I talked about is so much of what drives our choices is about pushing away discomfort, right? If I feel frustrated because my son knows better, I'm going to respond in a different way than if I notice that I'm feeling frustrated and that might interfere how I'm going to interact with my son. And I might actually spend more time trying to understand what my son is expressing so that I can meet his need rather than responding with, how do I push away the discomfort I'm feeling right now? This is also really, it goes in line with what I talked about last week in terms of anxiety. When you see your child in distress, when you get that feeling like your heart goes into your throat, how much of that drives our choices to save, to jump in, to ensure that my child doesn't experience that? Mindful parenting is about taking a step back. Oh man, I'm really uncomfortable when I sense my son is in distress. And as I notice the pattern, I tend to notice that when I feel that, I do everything to get rid of it. And that is when I save or I don't let them learn that they can be resilient. So, seed number two, and I go back to what I said about 1 degree change. When we're talking about mindful parenting, and I do this whenever I'm doing one-on-one sessions with parents, I will often say, listen, I'm talking about increasing your ability to notice 1 out of 100 times. It's like 1% of the time. You could fail 99 times. I want you to just every so often start to say, whoa, what's happening here? What's actually motivating me in this moment as a parent? What am I actually trying to resolve here? And as I start to do that more often, I start to develop the ability to take a step back and say, oh, I can understand now why this is a difficult moment for me. It's also a difficult moment for my child. And it's interesting because the literature suggests that as we increase mindful parenting, the ability to be compassionate towards the self and the child increases, and it decreases parental burnout. So really important for us to start to take a step back in these scenarios to try to understand what's going on for all parties involved. Additionally, as we increase our ability to be mindful parents, it also increases our ability to start to notice, oh, I kind of really screwed that one up. I wonder if, maybe I can apologize. I don't know about you guys, but I came from a culture where I don't think my parents ever apologized to me. And yet at the same time, one thing I've learned as a dad, and I've started to incorporate, is that some of the times when I'm apologizing for something, I'm not apologizing necessarily. I want to specify this. I want to clarify this. It's not about apologies about like rules or expectations. It's apologies when I might have responded to something that was about me versus about them. So I was annoyed or frustrated, and so I responded in a certain way. And so I might go back to that and say, hey, buddy, today when I did that and I raised my voice at you, I yelled at you, you know what? I was responding to something else, and I apologize that I didn't listen to what you were saying. Those moments of apology can be some of the most important and most powerful connections that I have with my boys. So as we increase our ability to be mindful, we can start to notice where maybe reparation is required. Any questions at this point? Maybe I'll ask. I don't usually do this, but maybe is there any questions about what I've talked about so far? Let's go to some concrete. Let's go to some concrete strategy. So I'm talking about mindful parenting. The ability to stop, pause, notice non-judgmentally. Start to say, I'm having, difficult moment. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm angry. I feel that my son's doing this on purpose. My wife hasn't, come in to help me today, or whatever it is that might be happening. It could be anything. Or most often it's her saying that about me. But it's just starting to notice those things. So let's talk about some concrete things that we can do. Just like, how do we do that? The question might be like, how do I even start to do that? I'm going to borrow from two things and strategies that we talk about in ACT, and acceptance and commitment therapy. Again, is the framework that I used. In ACT, one of the things that I love, I don't know if everyone feels this way, is that we tend to use a lot of analogies. So I'm going to throw two analogies at you to make this point. And the first one is the analogy of dropping an anchor. And in ACT, when we talk about dropping an anchor is basically a strategy to ground us in a given scenario. And the analogy is this is the analogy. Imagine that you are the captain of a boat and you're in the middle of the ocean. And as you are in the middle of the ocean, as you look off into the distance, you see a storm brewing. You see these dark clouds, you see that the water's starting to get choppy, and you recognize that you're not going to make it to port, so you're not going to be able to make it to land, and you can't get around the storm. In that scenario, you might drop an anchor. Any thoughts in the chat as to why you might drop an anchor in that situation? I'm going to type in the chat. So that's the goal, but in this example, it would be like to create some stability. When we drop an anchor in the boat, it does nothing to get rid or solve the storm. It is an attempt to create some stability and reduce being swept by the emotional storm. So when we teach dropping an anchor to individuals or parents, it is about noticing those moments where you're feeling overwhelmed, like you have no control. Things are going badly at work, your kids are having, meltdowns, your dinner was sucked in, whatever it is, your kids are telling you that they're bored of this and you're just feeling overwhelmed. In dropping an anchor, we basically follow three steps. The first step is notice what you're saying to yourself in that moment. Oh my God, this is too much. This is overwhelming. I'm feeling out of control. The second step within that first part is notice how you feel in your body. Like, I feel heavy. I feel a sense of doom. And I might put those together. Like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, lost. I feel a sense of heaviness and doom. And I might say, my God, I'm overwhelmed. The second step in dropping an anchor is recognizing that when I have an emotional reaction, my body responds in certain ways that are outside of my control. If I'm anxious, my heart starts racing. If I'm angry, I might get tense. And yet, even though I'm having those emotional reactions, I still have some say as to what I can do with my body. So the second step is like, okay, I notice I'm feeling a sense of doom and heaviness, and I'm going to start to squeeze my hands together, and I might take a deep breath. Those are under my decision making. Okay, I can do that because I decided to do those. And the third step is to engage in your senses. So I might be, my son's having a crying over here. My other son might be yelling, I'm feeling overwhelmed. And here I am doing this. And I might spend some time noticing colors around me, like what's yellow around me. I might touch my shirt and just feel its fabric. I might notice smells around me. And in that moment, what I do by using my senses is I become Ed, having a moment that's difficult and feels overwhelming. And as I label and create that grounding moment, I can start to decide what I want to do as a parent. The better you get at this, the easier it becomes. And so that's one step. How do we create moments of grounding so that we can make meaningful, value-based decisions as a parent, even though there's a storm swirling around us? The second concept is probably my favorite analogy in ACT, is this concept of flavoring and savoring. In here, I asked this question last week: is what do you value as a parent? What do you want? What kind of parent do you want to be? Do you want to be a supportive parent, a caregiver? Do you want to be a present caregiver? Do you want to be an understanding, a teacher, a disciplinarian? Whatever it is, think about it. As we increase our ability to be mindful, we can start to answer those questions. This is what I stand for as a parent. And then I imagine in this analogy, the analogy is this: imagine that I'm having people over for dinner, and it's my job to prepare the dish that we're going to have as in the party. And let's say as I prepare the dish, I say to myself, you know what? I really like black pepper. And so I purposely, noticing that I like black pepper, I will deliberately put black pepper on my dish. Later on, when it's time to eat and I take a bite, I'm going to notice the black pepper. And in that moment, I'm going to savor it, that black pepper. And part of the reason why I'm savoring it is because I purposely, deliberately put it into the dish because I wanted it to be there. And now apply that concept to parenting. Overwhelmed, things are falling apart, all these things are happening. What type of dad do I want to be? What type of caregiver do I want to be? And how do I find a way to sprinkle that into my day to day? And when it occurs, how do I enjoy it and savor it? When I'm working with families, I often make my cheesy dad joke. It's almost like and I use this. It's like I typically will take a moment and I almost take a screenshot of the moment. Like I'm like, what's happening? Who's around? What's happening? That sensation of like, man, I played a role in allowing for this to come up. And when I feel it, I sit and I savor and I take that screenshot. Let's talk about some steps towards mindful parenting. I'm looking at the time. I'm a little bit nervous about what we have to get through. So mindful. First step, listening with full attention. Your child is expressing something. It is about tuning in to your child, noticing nonverbal cues, tone, facial expressions. One thing to remember is that when we are stressed, our focus tends to narrow. Like if there's a bear in front of us, we're only noticing the bear. In mindful parenting, it is about taking a more global bird's eye view of the scenario so that we're not missing important information around us. The second step, which we've talked about already, is taking a non-judgmental stance of acceptance. Recognize difficult emotions, difficult scenarios are human. And rather than fighting with those and trying to fix those, we're going to start to look at it as like, yes, I get it. I get why this is really hard for you, son, daughter, child. I understand why this is a challenge. And trying to take a more non-judgmental approach is going to lead to more mindful parenting. As we start to do this, we become more open and aware of emotions and acknowledging them, starting to label them. We'll talk about this later. And moving from feeling overwhelmed by doing things like dropping an anchor towards decisions and actions that are valuable. Another really important concept is self-regulation. How you respond in stressful scenarios is going to be the best teacher for our children. And so as we start to be more mindful and we start to notice, oh man, I tend to do this every time, and that's not how I want to act, and I start to tweak things, we are teaching our children how we can have struggles as human beings and learn to make slight adjustments. Saying sorry and forgiveness is also a great way to show self-regulation. And as we do all these things, we're increasing compassion for the self and child, which I already addressed as to why that's really important. If you're having trouble with those, I'm going to give you like an acronym that comes out of the literature that's 4 parts to mindful parenting. The first is, so the word is part. Okay. The first step is being present, which is perceiving and understanding and responding to your child's needs. As you become present and you start to perceive and notice as a mindful parent, you start to increase your attunement, how you tune into your child's experience. And as you become more attuned to your child's experience, your experience of the scenario or situation becomes, it starts to resonate with your child's experience. And as we do all three, what we're doing is increasing trust. Because at the end of the day, the one thing we want to do as parents is to build a sense of trust for our children that when things go wrong, we are a safe haven. And that's it. Being a safe haven doesn't mean we don't fail, doesn't mean we don't get things wrong, doesn't mean that we don't have outbursts ourselves or moments of anger or frustration. It is that over time, the greater pattern is that even though we have these blips of moments of distress or failure as a parent, the prevailing theme is that you can trust that we will be there for you as parents or caregivers. So why are we even talking about? So we talked about like, okay, so we talked about parental burnout and how mindful parenting is a way to sort of mitigate some of the risk factors towards parental burnout. But in reality, what do we really want as a parent? And for most of us, I think what we want to sort of instill is a sense of resilience in our children. But what does resilience mean? When we're talking about resilience here, we're talking about a sense of adapting or bouncing back and thriving despite adversity, challenges, or stressful situations. It is not a way to avoid adversity, challenges, or stressful situations. We can't avoid these things. It is about teaching our children to bounce back and to return from disappointment and failure in moments of distress. And this involves things such as coping with stress, adversity, setbacks. It can also relate to emotional things that we're doing to increase our emotional well-being and overall growth. Again, here, the part I want to emphasize is that resilience building requires stressful situations and challenges and adversity. When we are thinking about resilience, the other thing I want you to think about is it's not a fixed trait. What I mean by that is you'll never achieve a certificate saying you are resilient. You've achieved 100% resilience. We are resilient. Our ability to be resilient changes by experiences, by things like developing new skill sets, turning to new support systems, finding different ways to respond to stressful scenarios. And there is some literature to suggest that there are some factors that actually increase how resilient we can be. So something like your temperament. Some kids will talk. I'll use the term later. Super feelers. Super feelers are the kids who feel things way more intensely than the rest of us, who will have significant bouts of like intense emotions, whether it's anger or happiness, and they have trouble sort of, being where the rest of us are at. They used to be at peaks. And for those individuals, sometimes being resilient can be more challenging. And so being mindful and recognizing that it changes how we might respond to a super feeler. And again, the takeaway here is as parents or caregivers, what we're doing is fostering a supportive and nurturing environment that also teaches things like problem solving, emotion regulation, and we play a role in emphasizing positive social relationships. This goes back to this idea of trust that I said a couple of slides ago. This last point is about our children being able to trust that we're going to do these things. Supportive environment, a nurturing environment, a place where they can learn and they can be things like self-regulation are modeled, and we're encouraging positive relationships and engagement in positive activities. So, what are some practical steps towards resilience? And this is we're going to talk a little bit about in more detail here. The first step is supporting our children to ride the waves of emotions. Emotions are going to come and they're going to get intense and go down. And what we're going to do is to be a support for them so that we can help them to navigate those emotions and also to start look at options during stressful scenarios or times. We're going to emphasize and model the importance of seeking help and leaning on a support network. And finally, one of the other things that we're going to do, not finally, one of the other things that we're going to do is we're going to play a role in instilling a sense of a growth mindset, the idea of a not yet principle. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. When my son turns to me and says, I can't shoot with power on soccer, I might say, yeah, not yet, not yet. Let's keep working on it. Right? It's something to be achieved rather than something that to be defined by. And by doing these things, so as we provide them support through the ways of emotion and start to allow them to connect with what the options are, and we teach them to ask for help and lean on a support network, and we start to discuss things like the not yet principle and growth mindset, we are cultivating a couple of really important things: a sense of self-worth and confidence. Couple of things I want to emphasize that I talked about last week. As we become more mindful parents and we start to think about some of the actions that we take that are there to help build resilience in our children, one of the important things for us to recognize is that we cannot save our children from all the experiences that are difficult or failures. If you saw the conversation last week, if you haven't, by the way, these are all up on my YouTube channel, the EPS Family Health YouTube channel. SPACE is a program that has been developed to treat childhood anxiety by helping parents become more mindful in their decisions as parents. And so, one of the things that's really important about SPACE is that teaching parents that when we try to protect our children from all failures or distress, we actually interfere with resilience building because our children do not learn that they can handle the things that they fear. The other thing that will come up, and I will discuss this in detail in a little bit, is this idea that notice if you are the type of parent who's always looking to solve a scenario for your child. When your child expresses something, are you right away saying, oh yeah, why don't you do this? Let's do this. Let's contact the school. We'll write an email. Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Notice that as a mindful, non-judgmental. We're going to notice that. And part of that, why we're noticing that, is one of the things I would encourage you to think about as we increase our ability to be mindful parents is to notice how golden silence can be. Noticing that drive to get rid of the discomfort when you see your child in distress, and then sit back and empathize, listen, and connect. If we're increasing our ability to be mindful, it is better to connect with your child in that moment than it is to provide solutions. This is something that I think is very hard at times to do. I know for me, I joke all the time. If it was up to me, my boys would be in bubble wrap, right? And so there are many times where I have to remind myself to think like a psychologist and not like a parent. The takeaway here in terms of resilience is that what we're working on is making our child feel understood and heard. And one of the things that's important is that being understood and heard does not mean agreed. Like there's no agreement necessarily here. So my child might do something that I disagree with, but I can still make them feel understood, that I understand how they felt that way, and that I'm hearing how they experienced that scenario. I don't necessarily need to agree with what they did. Okay. And as we do that, one of the things that we're starting to do is we're modeling the ability to instill a sense of confidence in them, to believe that they can handle those things that are difficult and challenging. And the other thing that's really important is we really start to emphasize, much like the not yet principle, is we're celebrating effort over results. This is different, by the way. This is different than getting a participation trophy. You see this argument all the time. Why does everyone get a participation trophy? I don't, that's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is as we develop skill sets and growth, we want to celebrate attempts and movement towards risking failure to gain in some way, right? If my child is failing, but they attempted, I am proud of that attempt versus them taking an approach of I won't even try because I know I'm going to fail. Okay, so we are celebrating and promoting trying things because that is how we approach meaning. So that's one thing I just wanted to emphasize there. So seed number three, and this is, I'm talking to you parents. I want you, if we're thinking about mindful parenting and increasing our ability to be mindful parenting, one of the things I want you to notice is that parenting is a process. A process means we're going to fail. We're going to screw up at times. And what we're trying to do is increase our ability to notice things, stepping back non-judgmentally so that we can improve our decision making. And again, thinking about small, incremental, meaningful change, which I'll get to in a bit. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Oh, I'm getting a little nervous about the time, so let's speed it up here. I did this one spooky because emotions can be scary. You know, as a parent, you're sometimes like, oh my God, I see this. An emotion can make us really uncomfortable. So this is why I made this slide spooky. But let me ask you, I'm going to ask in the chat. Let's say your child, no matter what age, let's say if they're too young, imagine that they're a bit older. Imagine your child comes up to me, goes up to you and says, I'm a loser and nobody likes me. How would you respond? If someone's willing to put in the chat, how would you respond to that? A couple of people are typing, so what makes you think that? That's an interesting response. Ah, we know a lot of people that like you. Ah, Regina, you're cheating a little bit, Regina. It seems like I think you've done some emotion coaching. I love it. I love it. So let's look at what most commonly we would do. Most of us would do one of these. Ignore, right? Look at the bright side. We love you. You're an amazing kid. Maybe we might engage in blame. Well, maybe if you didn't bother your brother all the time, or minimize, it's not that bad. Listen, there's so many other more important things, or dismiss. Doesn't even matter. That kid doesn't even matter. Why do you even care? Deny. No, 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 no. People like you. Don't think that. Reassure. Everything will be okay, son. Don't worry. Don't worry too much about that. Ask questions. Dig for more information. Who was it? What happened? What are we going to do about it? Fix and problem solve. So many of us, and I think it's just human for us to do this. We look when we see a difficult sort of expression of emotion in our children, and we will do some of these, a variation of one of these responses. But why? Why do we do that? Well, simply because we don't want our child to feel emotional pain. And also, and I would say more importantly, from a mindful parenting perspective, is we don't want to feel that emotional pain. I don't want to hear my child going through distress, and I will look to solve it. Sometimes it may be that we respond in that way because we have no idea what else to say, or we might think that we might make it worse. So if I pay attention to it, I will reinforce it. You might also disagree with it, or you have trouble understanding it. Like what? Like I talked about super feelers. How are you so upset about this? This is just a game. Like relax, dude. Like this is not a big deal. And more importantly, let's be honest, we weren't taught this. Did anyone teach us this? Did anyone teach us how to respond to emotions? Did anyone teach us how to be vulnerable with another human being, to connect and to be able to try to understand a perspective of what people are going through when they're expressing some of these emotions that we find challenging? So I'm going to show a video. You've probably seen it. This is the Brene Brown video. It's a very famous video. I'm going to show this video just because I think it sets a nice tone for what we're going to be talking about in the next part.
So, what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection, sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy: perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth; staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do; recognizing emotion in other people, and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, uh-huh. No. You want a sandwich? Um, Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." I had a, yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Love, 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 love that video. There's so much in there about vulnerability, about connecting. Oh, 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 oh. Sorry, guys. So much in that video about connecting, being vulnerable, trying to put yourself in the shoes of your children, rather than maybe responding in an automatic way that maybe dismisses or invalidates their experience. So let's look at some basics of emotions. First off, every emotion is a feeling in the body, so some physiological response. It has a name, right? In terms of anger, happy, sad, it has a need. Maybe I need comfort. Maybe I need to share enjoyment in an action, which is maybe I need to reestablish boundaries if I'm angry. Maybe I need to seek comfort and I need a hug and connection when I'm feeling down, or maybe I'm looking for people to share my joy with them when I'm feeling happy. And so one of the things that we do when we're thinking about emotion coaching for our children, and we've already sort of addressed some of these already for before, it's about attending to the emotion. Again, this is the attunement, tuning into the emotion, even if it's uncomfortable for us, labeling the emotion. Hear people talk about name it to tame it. This is really different for depending on the age of your child. So for a young child, you will be the one who's scaffolding them with emotional vocabulary. Like if your child is 2 or 3 and they're having some reaction, you are the one who is teaching them that. Hey, it looks like you're angry. Hey, buddy. I can tell because your voice is getting high and you look red and you're really tense, huh? So that might do that when they're 2 or 3. When by the time they get to 8 or 10, they start to know that because I've been reflecting that to them for years. And then lastly, the most important part is the validating the emotion, saying, I can understand why you feel that way. I get why you're angry or upset. And then switching towards meeting the need in some way, whether it's soothing, protecting, reassuring, and the practical need, whether it's we're redirecting, fixing, problem solving. These are have to be used mindfully, by the way, because these can also become problems if you remember to the conversation that I had about space. Um, but let's look at let's get concrete because this is sort of I have a few minutes left and I want to spend a little bit of time here. When we talk about validation, what we're talking about is conveying understanding of the child's emotional experience and showing that we get it. And I'm going to give you resources to how to do this, and there are free programs that will teach you how to do some of this stuff. But let's look at this. I don't know why we went backwards there. Give me a sec. Let's look at something because I want to get here. Let's say your child is experiencing a really an emotion that is a big emotion, anger, frustration. I wonder if they come up to you, you might say something like, let's say your child is upset because the other a sibling threw something at them and they're really angry. I might say, I can understand why you might feel angry. What do you want to say after that? What's a word that we all want to say after that? Anyone want to take a guess? And I know if you've done emotion coaching, you'll know the answer to this, but I'm curious for anyone who hasn't done it. If you want, and you say your child comes up to you with a difficult emotion, you might want to say, I can understand why you're angry, but, right? This is the 3-letter word that, and when we do emotion focused training, we try to teach parents to avoid. And the reason is that when we use the word but, what we do inadvertently is invalidate the what we said prior to. So I can understand why you're upset, but You're not understanding why you're upset. And so the shift here is we often teach parents to use the word "and," as someone said in the chat, or I can understand why you might feel to because. And if you look at EFFT training, it will talk to you about using three becauses to try to connect with your child. So an example might be, let's say you're dealing with a 15-year-old who you grounded, or they weren't allowed to go to a prom. You might say, I can understand why you're angry because you really wanted to go to the formal, and because your friends are all going to be there, and because you feel you're going to miss out. I get it. I understand. So, or if it's a 3-year-old, it might be, I can understand why you're angry because your brother took away your toy, and because you really love that toy, and because your brother didn't listen when you told him to stop. And so, in that validation, what I am doing is I'm trying to connect a sense, or trying to instill a sense of, I get it, I understand with my child, which is one of the very first steps for them to start to say, huh, here's a safe haven. Here's a parent who is attuned with what I am experiencing. And so here, an example again, and there's many ways to say this. So I can understand why you might feel this because, or you might start it with, no wonder you feel that way. Of course you feel that way. It makes sense. I don't blame you for feeling angry. I can only imagine that I would feel that way too, or I get it why you're feeling that way. And so if we're looking at emotion coaching through a mindful lens, what we're doing is we're trying to expand our ability to be flexible when dealing with emotions that are challenging for us to see in our children. And as we become more mindful, we can start to think about, what is it that my child requires in this moment? And how do I communicate that sense of connection? And that is by instilling a sense of validation. I get it. I understand why you're angry because of this, because of this, because of this. One of the keys, and this is where people get stuck, is when we validate, it doesn't mean we're saying okay to everything. We'll get that in a bit. This is a very short clip. They do such a beautiful job of showing validation. So let's look at this clip. You've probably seen it if you have young kids. Here it goes.
Hey, who's ticklish, huh? Here comes the tickle monster. Hey, Bing Bong, look at this. Oh, here's a fun game. You point to the train station and we all go there. Won't that be fun? Come on, let's go to the train station. I'm sorry they took your rocket. They took something that you loved. It's gone forever. Sadness. Don't make him feel worse. Sorry.
It's all I had left of Riley.
I bet you and Riley had great adventures.
Oh, they were wonderful. Once we flew back in time, we had breakfast twice that day.
Sadness. It sounds amazing. I bet Riley liked it.
Oh, she did. We were best friends.
Yeah, it's sad.
I love that video. Also, let me see. Sorry, guys. If at the beginning of that clip, happiness was trying to make them happy, right? Avoid and let's funny faces, and then sadness comes in and sits with the sadness, connects with the sadness. And so one of the things that I want you to think about is when we engage in more validating behaviors, more mindful validating behaviors as parents, what we're shifting towards is saying yes to emotional reactions. We're not necessarily agreeing with the behavior or the actions the child is displaying. So it is still important. We can validate while setting limits. I get that you are upset because your brother threw that toy at you, and because he didn't listen to you, and because you really like that toy, and because whatever it is that I'm saying to him. And you know that we don't throw toys, and so this is the consequence. I can understand you really wanted to go to that party, and you know that because all your friends are there, and because you think everyone's gonna have a good time, and because of this, and you know that you have a practice early tomorrow morning, and so you can't go to the party. So we can validate, connect with a child when they're having difficult emotions, while still instilling expectations, rules, and limits. And lastly, I want you to think about how, as you do this, as you do more emotion coaching, you're going to get things wrong. It's not going to go well. You might have big explosions or what have you. Forgive yourself. Be nice and kind to yourself when you make mistakes. Last thoughts. We're about to wrap up. I apologize, guys, for keeping you past 8. Last thoughts. This is the slide that I said to you. I've done a whole presentation on this, but I want to bring it all together in one small way, in a brief way. 1 degree change, small things matter. We can get overwhelmed. If I think to myself, I need to be a better parent, that is daunting. I don't know how to be a better parent. What I can do is I can notice one small thing that I can do today, like a flavor and savoring analogy. I can choose that today I'm going to be available. I'm going to be present. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be a source, a safe haven for my child. I don't know about being a better parent overall, but in this moment, I'm going to notice on one small thing I can control. 2, things interact, right? So when we feel overwhelmed and we feel powerless, think about the things you do have some control over. Can you notice when you're feeling overwhelmed? Can you go to sleep earlier? Can you make sure you're eating? And what you're going to notice, because things interact, as you get better sleep, you're going to become a more mindful parent. You're going to be more calm. You're going to be more present. So notice other things that you can sort of change or tweak to improve other aspects of the whole system that is families. Patterns matter. If we're stuck on being perfectionistic, we might think that one mistake taints everything. If I have one speck of sand in a big pool, is the pool now dirty because of the one speck of sand? At the same time, patterns matter in that if I start to do one small thing and I start to connect these things, I can create a pattern that leads to meaning. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. And then lastly, if you're feeling overwhelmed, thinking about being together, asking for help, turning to family, turning to friends, turning to professionals. And then lastly, we've talked about this, is looking at self-care as love. When you engage in self-care, you are actually showing love not only to yourself but to your children, because it is necessary for you to be the best caregiver you can for them. I'm going to leave you with one last example. It's very similar to the one I did last week, but I'm going to tweak it to account for my son. Uh, and if you've seen me talk, you've seen this example before. But I love it. I actually love it because I use it. Let's say that I want to be connected and I want to be present, and those are things I want to flavor my day with. I might notice that as I engage in mindful reflection, I might say, man, I'm really disconnected from my boys, and I feel like I haven't been present because I've been working long hours. And I decide that, starting on Monday when I get home, I walk in through the door, I set aside my phone, and I call over my little guy, Oscar, and I say, hey, Oscar, come in, buddy. And he comes over. And in that moment, we look at each other, and I might say, hey, buddy, what happened today? Tell me about your day. And maybe I spend a minute to a minute and a half just listening to him. One thing, small things matter. What I control that is in that interaction, nothing else exists. It is him and me in that moment. And as I listen to him for 1 minute, a minute and a half, if I leave that scenario by itself, that's a nice moment. But what if I do that on Monday and I do that on Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday? I do it for a whole week, and then next week I continue doing it to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I do it for 3 weeks, and I do it 4 weeks. What I have done is I've taken one small thing. I don't know about being a better dad, a better parent, but I can decide to sprinkle my day with something that's important to me. I'm going to sit and listen to my son in that moment, and I'm going to repeat it. And as I repeat it, I'm increasing meaning. And so I take something small, 1 degree change, and years down the road, my son is going to remember what I used to do when I got home from work. And so that's how we can take small little moments to create meaning. So if you find your child expressing big emotions that are hard for you, sitting with them, thanking them for sharing, saying, I don't even know what to say, but thank you for telling me. Those are the moments that will create meaning and engagement and connection. So, sorry guys, I feel like I rushed the last part. I apologize. Some resources for you. This was in the last book, in the last presentation. I'm a huge Lisa Coyne fan. She has The Joy of Parenting. There's a classic Dan Siegel book, Parenting from the Inside Out. If you have young girls, Untangled is a great book on parenting, teenage girls. Um, in terms of research, and I will share this, by the way, I'll share the recording and I'll share the slides as well. We have emotion focused skill training, mental health foundations. The mental health foundations, as I said last week, has free modules on emotion coaching. There's also Alan Kasdan has a free parenting program. That's going to be more a traditional parenting program, but it's free. I've also provided some links to some mindful parenting strategies and also some meditations for mindful parenting. Mindful parenting can be very difficult to know how to do. And so the meditations will guide you, will give you steps on how to engage in some mindfulness and self-compassion as a parent, which I think is really important and a skill that no one ever taught us. Sorry for all going so fast at the end. Any questions? And this is our contact information, by the way, EPS Family Health on Instagram, EPS Family Health on YouTube is the best place to find all the videos to my webinars. And there's a bunch of other little videos there. Please feel free to subscribe and follow, on Instagram. Any questions? Oh, that's a really good question. We will. So normally when I do a webinar, we sign up through emails. So you could email me. Actually, I'm gonna have the recording ready. So there's my email, Dr. E. Roldan at Topical Psych, and I can send you that to you. Normally, what I'll do is I'll pass on the video to Prime Care Family Health, and they can share it to anybody who sort of went through their registration process. If you didn't go through the registration process and you want it, just email me, and I'll send you that recording when it's ready. Any questions or comments? Thank you, Aaron. You're welcome. And next week is talking parenting for kids with ADHD, by the way. So I'm monitoring the chat just in case I see somebody typing. So, is there any questions at all? Anything people want to share? Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope you all come. And if you think it's going to be valuable, let other people know. I love doing these. They're free, right? You can come, engage, and learn a little bit. Hopefully you learned something. Thank you again, everyone. I guess there are no questions. So thank you. And I will be sending out the video shortly. Thank you to Aaron. Thank you to Gina and the whole team at Prime Care. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate you taking the time to join us today.